Hey there, it's Jennifer McGuire. Lately, watercolor has been very popular in card making, and I love the look of it, but it can be intimidating. So I wanted to show you a way to cheat and get a fun and easy watercolor background look, and also show you iron off embossing. So I actually created 6 cards today. It's just a variation of backgrounds and colors that I used, but they all were done with the same technique. So I'm going to walk you through one and then show you the variations I did with the others, just to give you some different ways that you can use these techniques and get a variety of looks. So let's go ahead and go through this first card. It happened to be my favorite. I love the colors here, and really this technique is super easy. For all of these cards, I used a Hero Arts background stamp. I really find that background stamps are something that you can use in such a huge variety of ways that it's worth it to invest in them. I use them quite often on my blog in very different ways. Well, today we're going to use it to resist some watercolor. So I have inked it up with Versamark ink, and I'm taking some Tim Holtz watercolor paper. That's my favorite watercolor paper, and I'm putting the flatter side down, the smoother side down, onto the stamp and pressing around. You really want to make sure you press around very well so that all of that ink gets into any of the grooves there may be in the paper. So once I've got that, I'm taking some clear embossing powder. I think clear works best for this because we're going to iron it off later. You don't need to iron it off if you don't want to, but I'm going to show you how to do it because I think the look is a little bit better. And then I'm going to zap this with the heat gun. I use the Hero Arts Milwaukee heat gun. I love this heat gun. It's really high quality, and I've had this one for probably 15 years now. So after I've heated this, you'll be able to see it's shiny where we have the embossed image. Now I'm going to go in and add some color here. I'm using distress inks for all of these techniques. I love distress inks because they react with water and act like watercolors. Now I am using the mini ink pads. These are new from Tim Holtz. And I like them because if you don't have the money to invest in all the different colors of distress ink pads, you can get the minis instead. Also, you can apply ink direct to paper with these mini ink pads a little bit easier than the bigger ink pads, which I'll show you later. I'm also using the mini ink blending tools, which are the round ones, and look how easy it is to add circles of area. I'm doing this very quick and easy. You don't have to worry about it blending or looking smooth or being perfect because this technique will do all of the work for you. The colors I'm using on this card are the peacock feathers. That's the first one I put down. This green is the mowed lawn, and then I'm going to go in and fill in with some salty ocean. I have that pink ink out, but I actually saved that and I use that for a different card. So I'm filling in those little white areas kind of with the side of my ink blending tools just so I can get a tiny little area there. Again, I'm not worrying about the colors overlapping or not being smooth. It doesn't matter at all. Now for the water here, I actually added some Perfect Pearl pigment powder so that it would be shimmery when it dries. You could use regular water, but what I did is I put about a half a teaspoon of this Perfect Pearl pigment powder into a full bottle of water and shook it up, and watch, you'll see the water has a shimmer to it. Again, you could use regular water here, or you can use a shimmer spray if you want to, but I really love how pearly the results are when you put the Perfect Pearls in the water. Now I want this to stay flat as it dries, so I'm temporarily adhering it to a flat surface. I used to do this on pieces of chipboard, but I have a new cutting board here that I can pick up and move aside, and I'll talk about that more later. Now I'm going to generously spray this. You'll see lots of puddles of color here. That's okay. The worse this looks at the beginning, the better it'll look in the end. That's how this technique works. So you'll see it's just a wet mess here. I'm going to set it aside and let it dry. It's best to let this dry and not heat it with a heat gun because that might mess up your embossing powder a bit. But all of the raised embossed areas form puddles of color between. So you get these kind of variations of color with that shine from the Perfect Pearl in it. And the results are just beautiful. And basically the distress inks and the water reacting together do all the work for you. And you get the look of a watercolored background, but you really didn't have to put in much effort. Now I like to remove that shiny embossing powder because I just think it gives a wow, how did they do that kind of look. So what I did here is I put a piece of typing paper, then my piece over it, and another piece of typing paper over that. Now I'm taking an iron here. This is just my iron that never gets used on clothing because I never iron. It's on a cotton setting, and I'm just going to apply some heat to it, and you'll see that this melts the embossing powder and transfers it from your embossed piece onto the scrap paper. So you can see it on the scrap paper there. Now I'm going to repeat this on a clean piece and do this again just to remove any more powder that might have been left behind. And what happens, instead of a shiny raised area where we had stamped and embossed, we'll have a very smooth, clean area. So you have a perfectly smooth, just gorgeous look when you're done. Now, be careful with your iron. You might want to get a cheap iron just to use for this, but I've never had any problems with it and I haven't messed up my iron. So if you're careful, I think it's no problem at all, but you could get a cheap iron if you need to. Now I noticed part of it didn't come off over here in the corner, so I'm going to repeat it, and you can keep repeating it until you get the results that you want. By the way, I used Hero Art's clear embossing powder, and I think it works really well for this technique. So now we have some shimmery shine where the ink is, but the part that was heat embossed is perfectly smooth and white and matte. So that's just a great way to get a watercolor look using a background stamp. So let me show you how I finished off this card, and then we'll do the other backgrounds. I went ahead and trimmed a little bit off each side so that when I put this onto a Hero Arts white note card, there was a little strip of white on each side of the card just to give it a finished look. So I put a lot of adhesive on this because I want it to lay flat, but it should lay pretty flat because we did the ironing anyways, which is another advantage of doing the ironing. I'm going to add this on the front of a card. Now I'll be honest with you, I really toyed with how to add a greeting to this. It took me a long time of playing around, but I finally decided just to pick a pretty strong sentiment, something that was big and bold, and then keep how I added to it pretty simple. So let me show you what I did. I'm using a piece of watercolor paper here again just because I wanted to stick with the same style of paper. And I'm going to stamp this Hero Arts greeting with Versamark ink and add the liquid platinum heat embossing. Now this liquid platinum is a great kind of champagne silver color, and it's just smooth and just so classy looking in real life. And I thought by keeping the sentiment simple and adding it to that fun background, I don't take anything away from the fun background. So I'm going to add the powder here and heat set it, and I actually cut this down into a strip, and I was going to add it as a strip across the card, but I changed my mind and decided to go ahead and die cut a label from this. So you see that label that's die cut on the top there? It's a Hero Arts label, and that's what I used to cut this little piece here, and this is what I decided to add to the cards. Now I decided to stamp my greeting off to the side and then cut off some of the right side here, so it kind of looked like this label was coming off the side of the card. So I'm just going to put this in my trimmer and cut it off and put some foam tape on the back of it and add it to the card. I really played around a lot with this also on where to put this sentiment. I thought about putting it in the top or the bottom. I really don't think it matters because I think the simpler you keep the sentiment, the better the background is allowed to shine. So the simpler the better in this case. So now that I've showed you the technique and how to pull the card together, I wanted to show you a few variations of backgrounds for this. So this first one is super bold. I'm again using a Hero Arts background stamp, and I just clear embossed it on the watercolor paper. This time I'm applying picked raspberry, seedless preserves, and salty ocean. And I'm just kind of doing a random pattern here. It really doesn't matter. You can see the advantage of the mini ink blending tool because you can get small areas, but you can use the large tool if you would rather. You could also use like a sponge to apply these colors if you don't have the tools. And I gotta say, these mini ink pads from Tim Holtz, these mini distress ink pads, are so adorably cute and fun to use. And it's a great way to invest in some if you don't want to buy the full ink pad. So now that I've done this, I'm going to temporarily adhere it to my cutting board. I just use a cutting board because it's something flat that I can move to the side. I was using pieces of chipboard before, but I was going through so many that I needed something that I could reuse. So you saw I sprayed that like crazy with the pearlized water that I made before, and look how beautifully it dries. So now I wanted to show you how you could do a softer background look because the two I did before were pretty bold. And this one couldn't be any easier. Basically, I'm just taking a variety of like a rainbow color of inks here and just lightly smearing it across the page. The lighter I put it on, the lighter the end results. I started with picked raspberry, then spiced marmalade, mustard seed, mowed lawn, peacock feathers, and salty ocean. And I really wasn't careful about blending it, and it's okay if the colors overlap because that creates new colors. So now I'm going to temporarily adhere this to my little cutting board here, spray it with water. I kind of ended up with some really splotchy areas of water here, and I think it would have dried fine, but I was paranoid because those were a little dark and I wanted this to end up light. So I'm just taking a baby wipe, or you can use any kind of cloth, and just touch the corner of it to these puddles of color, and it'll suck it up and remove some of that water. And when it dries, you get the soft rainbow color effect here. Now this next one is also soft, but I pulled in another color that I think works so good with this technique. It's the pumice stone color. Now this is just a gray color of distress ink, but when you add it with that perfect pearl water that I created, that pearlized water, it ends up drying to be like a shimmery silver. If you've ever seen an Apple MacBook Pro, that nice like kind of pewtery silver color, that's what it looks like. It's just gorgeous. So it's one of the colors that I think is a must-have when you're doing a watercolor effect with this pearlized water that we created. Now you'll see I'm just going to spray this. It's going to look like an absolute mess, but when it dries, all those puddles of colors will end up drying and giving us a gorgeous look. And where I did that silver color will end up with a nice silvery look. Where we did the pumice stone, it ends up a silvery look. Now this next example shows two different things. One is I used a background stamp that has more solid area. What ends up happening is some of the color will dry on top of that solid area, and when you iron it, it kind of pushes some of that color in. So you can see in the areas where this stamping was, it's not a perfect white. There's a little bit of color there, but that's okay. Also, I used pumice stone and antique linen. Antique linen distress ink color, when it mixes with this pearlized water, gives a goldish color, like a soft gold color. So these two together, you get like a soft pewter color and a soft gold, and they're just beautiful, and it'd be great for a wedding card. Now this last one is pretty bold and intense colors. I love it, but it might be too bold for some of you. Maybe you should wear your sunglasses here. But this is an example of where you can take these mini ink pads and just wipe them across the paper. You could do this with the bigger ink pads, but it's easier to control with these little guys. So I'm taking picked raspberry, spiced marmalade, and mustard seed, I believe, and just smearing colors across here. You could do a rainbow effect. I just alternated colors. You can see I'm not blending them. There's some white showing through. It's all okay. Because, again, we're going to get out our pearlized water that we made and mix it. It does all the work for us. It mixes it up all on its own and will cause the blending to occur. Now again, any of these techniques you could do with regular water, or you could use a shimmer spray like the Perfect Pearl Mist or any kind of shimmers you may have. Sometimes I like to move some of the color around with my finger just to force it to blend if it's not doing on its own, but I found the less you kind of mess with it, the better the results. So once that dries, look at this bold color and that pearlized shine that you get. It's really fun to see what combinations work together. So there I have a set of 6 cards, 6 birthday cards, so I'm set for another month with all my friends with birthdays. And you can see the variety of looks that you get. So depending on how you apply the color, how much water you use, how little ink you use, all the things, you can vary everything and get a different look every time. Now I used all Hero Arts background stamps. Some of these are basic gray and Hero Arts background stamps, but you can use any kind of background stamp. You could also just repeatedly stamp a border image or another kind of image. Now here's a closer look at this one. Remember, it had a lot of solid stamped area. When you iron it off, some of that color gets left behind, but that's okay. If it bothers you, you can use a craft knife to scratch it away, but I think it kind of adds to the effect that you get with this technique. Okay, now you're going to laugh at me here because after I did this, I noticed that I glued the front of this card on upside down. So I do this all the time. So I just take off my adhesive. I use that Tombow stamp runner and it removes easily and will move if you need to. And now I have it back to normal. I do that so often. But anyways, there are your 6 cards with the different backgrounds. I also wanted to mention that I used a variation of this technique yesterday on the Hero Arts blog, and I'll put a link here to the video where you can see this card here. I used a background stamp that had lots of solid area, and then the space where the words are was removed. So I did the same technique I did here, but I put watercolor over it, and it looks like I watercolored all of those images, but really I did the same technique here and ironed off the background. So be sure to check out that video. If you're interested in any of these products, they're linked below in the YouTube description, or you can see much more information at my blog, jennifermcguireinc.com. Thanks so much for watching.